and welcome to the Books on Asia podcast, sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years, located at www.stonebridge.com. And I'm your host, Amy Chavez. Today we have with us Richard Lloyd Parry. He's author of People Who Eat Darkness, a story about a young foreign woman who vanished from the streets of Tokyo. And we'll also be talking about one of his other books called Ghosts of the Tsunami. Welcome, Richard.
That's a great pleasure, Amy.
People Who Eat Darkness. You said that the title comes from Toru Matsugaki from Yami o Ku Hitobito.
Well, yes. Yami o Ku Hitobito is a book that was published by Mr. Matsugaki in Japanese about 2 years before my book was published. And he is a journalist and non-fiction writer. And he published a book about the Lucie Blackman, Giorgio Obara case, which was also the subject of my book. I was aware of that book and I bought it and I had my assistant look at it and parts of it translated for my own reference. And the thing that struck me most about it was that title, Yami o Ku Hitobito. And I'm told by Japanese friends that in Japanese that phrase signifies people who go over to the dark side. I believe that it sounds even better in English than in Japanese. And from the moment I heard it, I thought, what a brilliant title. What a shame that someone else has used it for their book so that I can't use it for mine. And of course there is no copyright in titles, but it still seemed a bit cheeky to steal someone else's title. I thought I wouldn't do it. But then I got in touch with Mr. Matsugaki and interviewed him and talked to him about the case and about his research. And just at the end I said, that is such a great title. I was wondering, how would you feel if I was to use it in English? And he said, fine, please go ahead. So People Who Eat Darkness it was. The Japanese translation of my book, of course, doesn't use that title, the book. It's a different title in Japanese. But to me, it's possibly the best thing about my 400-page book, is this title of 4 words. And the reason I like it is that some people who read the book are annoyed because there's no reference to the title in the book, and that puts them off. But to me, that's actually a strength. It's intended to be a title that makes you think not about a particular part of the book, but about the book in general. And the most important thing about it is that it's people who eat darkness rather than the person who ate darkness. It's not just about the villain in the book, the killer, Giorgio Obara. In different ways, all the main characters in the book eat darkness, depending on what you take that to mean. The killer, of course, the victim, her family, the author, and also all the readers of the book too.
Well, I have to say that it's an extremely effective title, so effective that I was afraid to read the book. And that's the only reason I actually put it off for so long. Because
if it's actually putting off readers, that's a negative.
It's okay, it's okay. No, it comes around because I was like, because I'm not such a brave person. And I was afraid that it was going to sink into the depths of, the gory details and this and that. And what happened is I started reading Ghosts of the Tsunami. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is such an amazing book. I've got to read his other book. And from reading Ghosts in the Tsunami, I realized how good a writer you are. I mean, not only is it just, the depth of your vocabulary and your descriptions and everything, but you know not to cross certain lines. And you're not going to go in and prey on people's emotions. You're just going to tell it straight. You're going to remain impartial. And I appreciated that so much. And I was like, I've got to read this other one. So I went back and I read People Who Eat Darkness. And there's so much information in there about Japanese society. Lucie Blackman, of course, disappeared. She was a hostess at a hostess club. And you go into that. And of course, anyone who's lived here for very long is very aware of the hostess clubs, and we've all been to lots of them. And even women go to them, or can. And I've certainly been taken to lots of them just by friends or professors or whoever. And I've seen lots of strange things, but nothing bad. And you do wonder, where's the line there between like the sex industry, just touchy-feely industry and all that. And you go into that in depth and you explain how it works. And you even interview a guy who has his own hostess club, and he tells you how it works and everything. And I could just see him, like, I was picturing him as like a DJ up on this stage looking down and, you know, seeing, are people enjoying themselves or not? And then I'm going to switch this around, I'm going to put on, you know, this different record or send this different girl over to him.
Instead of record, girls.
Yeah, I think that once you are aware and you have that background knowledge of what the hostesses do, it's much easier to see how all of this happened. One of my favorite characters was actually Tim Blackman. You've got this misunderstood guy, and you know, and then after a while you're thinking, well, maybe he's not so the best person. Then you think, oh, well, maybe he's okay, and going back and forth, because everyone, of course. I thought it was interesting that when he held his press conference, he's come from Britain over to Japan to try to find his daughter who has disappeared. Everyone commented how he was so stoic and didn't break down in tears. He was just straightforward. And that was considered kind of unreal to people. On the other hand, you can see the Japanese people, you know, amidst a tsunami, earthquake, whatever extreme tragedy, yet people are not crying and like the way they would be on American TV when they go to the scene of a tornado or something. People are just devastated and they're not composed. So I was wondering how that differs.
Tim Blackman, who's the father of Lucy, the girl who died, was an extraordinary character, and it was very interesting getting to know him and writing about him. And he did defy convention and defy assumptions people had. He came out with his other daughter, Lucy's younger sister, early on to find out what had happened to her when she was missing. No one knew what had happened to her for months. They got a lot of press attention, and people were eager to help, of course, because here was this family in a terrible situation, a young daughter missing in this strange country that they knew little of. And they wanted to help, and they were sympathetic. That's a very human and generous response. But you realise that a lot of people who want to help, they believe that they're doing so unselfishly and altruistically. But actually, although they usually don't realise it themselves, they are expecting something in return. And one of the things they want to get back from the person they're helping is the flattery of being needed and being depended on. And it is common and in some ways conventional for people in that situation to behave in a very needy, helpless way, to be overcome with emotion, to be weeping, to be all at sea. And Tim Blackman arrived and wasn't like that. He was focused. He was organised. He held these press conferences. There were things he wanted to do. He engaged with the media, was helpful to them. And people found this off-putting. They found it cynical in some ways. It even made some people suspicious that maybe in some way he was involved in his daughter's disappearance, that something was being hidden. Now, nothing could be further from the case. But you realise that people have prejudices about the way that bereaved and crisis-stricken people should behave. Now, from the Japanese point of view, as you say, big shows of emotion and breakdown and so on are not so much the style here. People tend to express their grief with sort of silence and being choked rather than crying. But what I think Japanese people expect of families in that situation is that they are helpless. They essentially, when they're wheeled up before the cameras, is they talk about their loved one, they say they want them back, and then everything else is left to the police. And Tim Blackman didn't do that. He wanted to play a part in this operation to find her.
Like, was it the Japanese people then? People back home probably wouldn't bat an eye. They would think, I would do the same thing, right?
Yes, I think so. It all unfolded over a very long time, months and eventually years. And one of the stories that I tell in the book is the story of the Japanese police and their disastrously bad investigation. I mean, in the end, they just about got their man, but they should have got him much sooner. they fouled up. Japanese journalists don't talk about that. They don't question or reproach the conduct of the police. It's one of those strange taboos, a bit like Korean nationals and the imperial family. It just doesn't come up, even when the police are obviously screwing up. Tim Blackman wasn't afraid to directly criticise the police. And for a lot of people, that was bracing and shocking in a way.
Well, and then at the same time, you have Obara himself, the perpetrator, who's taking control of his own trials, isn't he? He's going out there and he's getting people to do investigations, and he's commissioning books to be written, I suppose, on his behalf. And so you've got this guy who seems so un-Japanese as well, and his must have been really difficult for his defense.
Giorgio Obara was also an extraordinary and very unusual criminal suspect. And he made life very difficult for the police for the simple reason that he didn't confess. Because the Japanese police are very good at... Japan, of course, has famously, staggeringly low crime rates for a highly industrialized society. It's a very peaceful, orderly place, as we know. But part of what that depends on is that Japanese criminal suspects confess. When they're caught and they've done it, they admit they've done it, and that makes the whole business of trying and sentencing them very easy. When you have someone who does not only doesn't confess, but fights in every conceivable way, exploits every possible loophole, and uses every resource to deny his guilt, then the whole system ground almost to a halt, and the police and the courts struggled with that very much. It's interesting you point out, you make this comparison between Tim Blackman and George Obara, because I got to know Tim quite well over the years, and I used to talk to him a lot, and I would go back and talk to him again and again for long interviews. And there was one time I was talking to him at his home in Britain, and Obara was close to the end of the road. He was going down for a long time, it was clear. I said to Tim, how now do you feel about Obara? I expected him to say the conventional things. He's a monster. He's a devil. He should never be allowed out. He's ruined our lives. And Tim did feel those things. But what he said was, I almost feel sorry for him. I see someone who has got into a terrible mess. It seems almost blasphemous to say this, and I don't think I would say it unless Tim had kind of said it himself. But there are affinities between those two men. They're about the same age. Above all, it was their outlandish determination. And one of the remarkable things about Tim is that a bereaved father, a man in that situation, had the self-awareness and the insight to see that similarity himself, and almost to sympathise with George Obara. At least he was able to see George Obara as a human being, as a terrible human being, a failed, flawed human being, but a human nonetheless. Yeah, so often when you deal with crimes like this, the big question people want to answer, of course, is why? Why would someone do this? Why would a man go through his life serially drugging and raping and victimising women?
Over 200, right?
Who knows? That number is in dispute, but a lot. Mm-hmm. The answer a lot of people give is, well, he's evil. And to many people, that's all there is to be said. He's evil. In other words, he's not like us. In some ways, he's not human. Evil being this category into which some people are cast, which makes them drastically and permanently different from the rest of us. I don't believe that. I don't think that's how human beings are. We're all human. I can't say why Giorgio Obara became the way he was, and I tried hard to work it out. I've got some ideas, but not the final answer. Whatever the reasons, they came from his humanity. Tim Blackman, remarkably, was able to see that too.
And it seemed like, he really thought that what he was doing was not so wrong. Even if it was wrong, it was still justified because...
It's very difficult to say. It took me years to research and finish it.
10, right?
Yeah. I wasn't only writing a book for 10 years, but still, as you know. Quite early on, I thought, well, I ought to read some true crime books. It wasn't a genre I was really interested in. And so I read a few. I read The Executioner's Song by Norman Mailer, and a couple of books about the Yorkshire Ripper and various serial killers. And when you read some of those books, you realise there's a convention that towards the end, maybe the last chapter but one, the the author puts on the kind of psychologist hat, plays the shrink, and explains the killer and why they did this. And I assumed for a long time that's what I would do, delve into Giorgio Obara's background and life, and I would be able to explain to the world why he did what he did. And I realised after several years and a lot of effort that I couldn't do that. And at first I was disappointed, and that seemed a bit like something like a failure of my investigation. But I realised actually that no one can do that of any other human being. People are not actually reducible to a series of bullet points that you can put in the chapter of a book. I was able to build that uncertainty into the way the book was written, and I hope it's a better book for that.
I had a lot of sympathy for Lucie because so many people in the same situation, like when she got into that car with this guy and went to his apartment, it seems like, well, who would do that? Who would just get into a car with a guy? But actually, she had met him several times before at the Hostess Club. It's part of her job to see the customers outside of work. You only go to dinner with them and stuff, and you don't do anything else. But nonetheless, in Japan, these are things, like you were saying, it's such a safe country, that it changes the way your defenses are down. And so a lot of people even, like you said, were blaming her. Well, why did she do that? There were lots of things in here, and you even pointed out, well, lots of people would have done what she did, and lots more people are going to do what she did, because usually it's fine.
That's all true. It took a long time for the full details of what had happened to Lucie in the last few hours of her life to come out. And we still don't know everything, but from what we do know, nothing she did was outrageously foolish.
Compensation money is something in Japan where the perpetrators are expected to give compensation money to victims or the family of victims. And then at one point, Tim Blackman was offered a large sum of money, but also it was conditional that Obara wanted him to, do certain things. And he ended up accepting that money.
Giorgio Obara, during the course of his trial, he came from a very wealthy background, and he offered money to various people connected with the case. Some of them inducements to people not to give evidence. Quite close to the end of the case, he gave, and Tim Blackman accepted a large amount of money, which brought a huge amount of opprobrium and criticism down on Tim Blackman. The only really important question was whether it would affect the outcome of the case. Now, as you know, in Japanese criminal justice, when a perpetrator gives money to a victim, that is often considered and taken into account by the court. So if I'm driving drunk and I knock you down and you're in hospital and you miss work, if I can go to the judge and say, well, look, I paid the medical expenses and I've also given this sum of money to show how sorry I am, please, treat me leniently, then often the court will. That wasn't Obara's situation. All the way through, and even up until now, he denied any criminal responsibility whatsoever for Lucie's death. So he wasn't saying, I did a terrible thing and I've given some money to the family, please, go easy on me. He was saying, oh, well, something terrible happened and I feel sorry for the family and I gave them some money, but it's absolutely nothing to do with me. The judge in the ruling explicitly said, I note that this money was paid, but it played no part in my decision-making. So it made no difference.
Do you think he was perhaps trying to ingratiate himself to, Tim so that he wouldn't press further on certain aspects?
I'm trying to remember the full details now. I believe that in return for the payment of the money, Tim Blackman signed a document which, in rather vague terms, seemed to question some of the evidence. So he certainly was hoping it would help his case, but it didn't.
I'd like to move in now into Ghosts of the Tsunami. Again, this is a book I took way too long to get around to reading because the tsunami was in 2011. When you live in Japan, we were kind of for so long bombarded with so much information about the tsunami, and it was such a horrible thing that you just, like the whole country mourned for a year. No one even, went on vacation. Everyone scaled down their celebrations, all in this collective, kind of mourning to respect the victims. It's amazing because even though we are all wrapped up in it, like I live in Okayama, I'm very far from Tohoku, and I've never been to Tohoku, which I don't think is unusual. A lot of people who live in Japan have never been there. It's way up north. And of course, everything we saw on the TV and such was, astonishing and unbelievable, and your heart went out to these people. But reading this book is like, you're right there as it's happening. And that's the difference. And you actually have a feeling of what happens when a tsunami comes. And one of the most intriguing things I felt was when you were talking about how when the tsunami warning came out, the people didn't take it seriously, or in this area that you're talking about. And that the people living there didn't even consider that they lived near the sea, because they were quite inland, and no one ever imagined a tsunami could even make it that far. And I'm so familiar with this kind of thinking because of where I live. I live on a small island of 500 people in the Seto Inland Sea. And we get typhoons all the time. And sometimes they're very destructive, and we've had landslides and such. And now that they're even more frequent, all these natural disasters, every time a typhoon comes, they get out on the speakers saying, everyone evacuate to the elementary school, which is up on a hill. And after a while, it has no effect. The first time, we're like, oh my gosh, we better evacuate. And we did. We went up there, and there were like a dozen people that evacuated out of the entire island. We also can't evacuate every time. It's almost a physical impossibility. And so I could understand that those people, they just, it doesn't really have anything to do with us. But on the other hand, how do we know? We shouldn't be we're not the ones who should be making these decisions, yet we do. We say, we'll be fine.
Yeah, I mean, it is... The whole question of warnings is a great subject of debate and anguish in disaster circles and policy making, because as you say, it's like the boy who cried wolf. If you give a warning every time there's a high wind or one of these 10-centimeter tsunamis coming in, then eventually people are just going to stop taking them seriously. But sometimes you don't know how big the tsunami is going to be until it actually dawns. They're very complicated and mysterious phenomena. That's
what I realized reading this book. I was like, wow, I haven't a clue until I started reading it. And the people were talking about the rivers like going backwards, right? Running backwards and turning white. And they were like, what's going on? They didn't even realize that was, one of the indications that the tsunami was right behind it.
I was down by the seaside the other day in Golden Week with my family, and the first thing I do now is look for those signs that tell you how many meters you are, and also have the arrows to the hill.
Yeah, I doubt our hill is even, high enough to make much of a difference unless we had more time to get to the very highest point on Shiraishi, which is 160 meters.
I mean, the highest that the Tohoku tsunami came in was 40 meters.
Yeah.
That's a 11-story building.
Yeah.
It gives you a lot to think about.
It does, and it brings the reality to the reader, and that's the most important thing. That book is going to have more effect on people than any statistics that the government's going to come up with, or warnings, or this or that, because you have then, background insight into what happens that, of all the things you never thought about.
Oh, well, I hope so. I'm glad that you found that. I mean, one of the challenges I faced, and one of the things I thought about a lot in considering this book was how to get beyond the statistics. I wanted to tell the story of the disaster in all its scale, and the horror of that massive death toll, 18,500 people dead. But you can't tell the story of 18,500 people in a lifetime. I knew I had to narrow it down and find smaller stories which I would tell in detail, and then somehow try to enable them to stand for the wider tragedy.
Yeah, and of course the other thing is it actually wasn't just those 18,500 people. Once you add in all the people that are still missing and all the people who died either illness or took their lives because they had nothing left to live for and all that, the tsunami is one thing. And then there's, of course, the years after that. There are a lot of very, very touching stories in there. You talked about shamanism And the Tohoku has a history of seers and people who talk to the dead.
When you're considering the supernatural and supernatural beliefs, it doesn't actually matter what I believe about these things, whether I believe in ghosts or shamans or seers. What matters is whether the people there believe them, and people do. These beliefs had and continue to have a material effect on the way people live their lives and the decisions they made. So that's what you're writing about, is not whether there are really ghosts and whether they provide evidence of survival of the human personality after death. You're writing about the living and the way they live their lives.
Is this the quote where the title of the book comes from? When people die violently or prematurely, in anger or anguish, they're at risk of becoming gaki, hungry ghosts, who wander between worlds, propagating curses and mischief. Is that where the title, Ghosts of the Tsunami, comes from?
There are two main strands to the book, really. There are a lot of stories wrapped in there, including a certain amount of personal account. There's the story of Okawa Elementary School, which was the only school in the country where children died at school, and it was to a catastrophic extent. The teachers failed to evacuate the children, and the whole school was inundated, and many children and teachers died. And the other part of the book is the phenomenon that I began to notice after about 6 months, where you heard a lot of ghost stories, people reporting a diverse range of supernatural experiences, ranging from just feeling a bit uneasy when they walked down by the sea, to seeing spooky reflections in puddles, to strange white shapes and dead people walking and sitting in their houses, right through to cases of people who appeared to be possessed, their bodies taken over by the personalities of people who died in the disaster. And so those are the two stories I wanted to put together. And in some ways, the Ghosts of Tsunami are I recount these stories fairly straightforwardly. I don't pass judgment on their veracity or otherwise. But the point about the ghost stories is that they were experienced by people who were not affected by the tsunami, who lived inland, who had not lost friends, family, property, but nonetheless were having these experiences. And to me, what that expresses is, whether you believe in ghosts or not, is the massive psychological trauma which affected not only the direct victims, but the whole region, really, the whole community.
You talk a little bit about yourself in both of the books, a little bit how these events affected you. In People Who Eat Darkness, it was in the form of maybe some people coming to get you, some nationalists and people who thought that you were doing Japan a disservice by writing articles and such. And then again, in Ghosts of the Tsunami, you're just around all this stuff all the time, and sometimes you would think, why am I here? Why am I doing this? And it must have been overwhelming. How can you go back to Tokyo, like you said, into your 11th floor, office? How do you not walk around just scared to death?
By necessity, you acquire a knack in the end for detaching yourself from these subjects you're writing about. You couldn't function if you allowed every tragedy you encountered to be your own tragedy. At some point, you have to be able to say, well, this is my job. I'm here like a doctor or nurse to do my job, to behave professionally, and to do the work that's expected of me. And I am able to do that now. When I was younger, I found it harder, but it's something you learn.
I couldn't help but kind of smile when I read the part in People Who Eat Darkness that once you had received this envelope with information about you, which wasn't actually supposed to come to you, and then you started realizing that, someone has been watching you.
Yes, it was unnerving. What happened was that for some years, I'd been reporting and writing about this character, Giorgio Barra, who was eventually convicted of crimes connected to Lucie Blackman and other people. And he was aware of me and what I was doing and my writing. And at one point he sued me for libel, unsuccessfully. He lost the case. And then I received this strange envelope. It became clear that somebody, and I cannot say who, although I have my suspicions, somebody had been sending out letters encouraging members of right-wing organisations to take revenge on me for my supposed hatred for Japan and dislike of the Japanese. That was at first alarming, but based on my assumption about who had sent these envelopes, I wasn't actually afraid that it would result in violence against me or my family, because the person I had in mind was and is a coward and has never physically confronted any of his victims. I tried to be realistic about these things and to be aware of risk and to manage it. So I'm not blasé about it, but if I felt I was at risk, I would react accordingly and take precautions.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks, Amy. It's been a pleasure.
You've been listening to the Books on Asia podcast, produced and edited by Michael Palmer. Logo by Alex Kerr. Sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years. They can be found at www.stonebridge.com. For more interviews, book reviews, and other features, visit the Books on Asia website at booksonasia.net.